The Second Amendment is designed to keep the power in this country with the people.
You may think that Congress does nothing about guns, and the fact is, Congress has failed.
The left is too busy disarming law-abiding citizens like yourselves.
We all want to keep children safe in school, but this bill wouldn't do that. This bill is just another Democrat attack on the Second Amendment.
In the Heller case, the Supreme Court made clear that the Second Amendment protects firearms in common use.
The Second Amendment provides, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
Decoding the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, a source of fervent debate and diverse interpretations, continues to echo through American history. Its succinct yet intricate wording has sparked discussions that range from forceful defenses to bitter blame. In the aftermath of tragedies like the Parkland school shooting, the nation is once again immersed in conversations about arms rights and control, prompting a closer examination of this constitutional provision. The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." While seemingly straightforward, the interpretation of these words has fueled scholarly analyses, legal arguments, and historical debates. The critical phrase well-regulated militia has been at the center of these discussions, with varying perspectives on whether it exclusively refers to state militias or extends to individual arm ownership. Some assert that the framers intended to safeguard organized militias akin to today's National Guard, while others argue for the protection of individual armed rights, anticipating their role in potential militia service. As the nation grapples with the complexities of the Second Amendment, its meaning remains a nuanced and evolving tapestry woven through the fabric of American constitutional history.
The Second Amendment is designed to keep the power in this country with the people.
You may think that Congress does nothing about guns, and the fact is, Congress has failed.
The left is too busy disarming law-abiding citizens like yourselves.
We all want to keep children safe in school, but this bill wouldn't do that. This bill is just another Democrat attack on the Second Amendment.
Heller brings some clarity. To some extent, the issue was clarified, if not settled, by the Heller decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2008. The 5-4 decision held that the Second Amendment meant individuals had an inherent right to own arms for lawful purposes. Heller applied that standard to overturn a ban on privately held handguns enacted in the District of Columbia. But the same basic reasoning has also been used to defend the private ownership of AR-15 type rifles, such as the one used in Parkland and other mass slings in recent years. Congress tried to ban assault-style weapons in 1994, but put a 10-year sunset provision in the law. It survived court challenges at the time, but when the 10-year term had passed, the majority control of Congress had also passed, from the Democrats who had enacted the ban to the Republicans who let it lapse. Since then, all efforts to restrict the sale of such weapons have failed. Even relatively bipartisan attempts at strengthening other restrictions, such as the Manchin-Toomey background check expansion bill in 2013, have fallen short of the necessary supermajority needed for passage in the Senate. It wasn't, as President Trump alleged Wednesday, because of a lack of presidential backup. President Barack Obama supported the bill, as Senator Pat Toomey, a Pennsylvania Republican, pointed out to Trump. Republicans filibustered the bill, which got 54 votes. In each case, defenders of armed rights have evoked the Second Amendment, the text that casts a long shadow across all discussions of arms in the United States. At times, it seems to all but end such a discussion.
In the Heller case, the Supreme Court made clear that the Second Amendment protects firearms in common use.
The Second Amendment provides, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
Democrats never once reached out to us to seek our input on the legislation we are considering here today.
You may recall in particular one debate in which Hillary Clinton talked about the Heller decision.
Parkland changes calculus, but now the tide is running the other way. The Parkland shootings have created a new moment and a new movement led by teenagers who survived the tragedy and took their protests to social media and beyond. Suddenly, even Trump is tossing out ideas about keeping students safe, arming teachers, restraining arms sales through background checks and higher age limits, and even banning accessories such as bump stocks that enable non-automatic weapons to fire rapidly and repeatedly. And it's still unclear what Trump wants exactly. Republicans on Capitol Hill seem flummoxed by Trump's posture. After Trump's made-for-cable bipartisan meeting at the White House with members of Congress, Texas Republican John Cornyn, a leader on armed issues in the Senate, seemed to scratch his head. I think everybody is trying to absorb what we just heard, Cornyn told reporters. He's a unique president, and I think if he was focused on a specific piece of legislation rather than a grab bag of ideas, then I think he could have a lot of influence, but right now, we don't have that. He added that he didn't think simply because the president says he supports something that it would pass muster with Republicans. I wouldn't confuse what he said with what can actually pass, Cornyn said. I don't expect to see any great divergence in terms of people's views on the Second Amendment, for example. And there are those two words again, Second Amendment. If new restrictions are enacted, a prospect far from certain, as Cornyn rightly points out, they will surely be tested in the courts. There, it will be argued that they infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear firearms. In other words, they will run afoul of, that's right, the Second Amendment. Anticipating that, some armed control advocates and at least one lifelong Republican want to leap to the ultimate battlement and do it now. They want to repeal or substantially alter the formidable amendment itself. That would seem logical, at least to those advocates. If some 70% of Americans want more armed control and the Second Amendment stands in their way, why shouldn't they be able to do something about it? Someday, it is conceivable that people and politicians of the United States may be ready for that, but that will need to be a very different United States than we know today. Why? Because amendments to the Constitution, once ratified, become fully part of the Constitution. Changing or removing them requires a two-stage process that has proved historically difficult. The Founding Fathers were willing to be edited, it seems, but they didn't want to be easy. So they made the amending process a steep uphill climb, requiring a clear national consensus to succeed.
The lack of respect for the Second Amendment that took place in the state of New Mexico so recently.
Many Parkland families strongly believe that gun companies must also be held responsible for the dangerous marketing of assault weapons.
House Judiciary Committee to defend the Second Amendment from the attacks being levied by my Democratic colleague.
Why it takes consensus. A proposed amendment to the Constitution must first be passed by Congress with 2/3 majorities in both the House and the Senate. The two chambers haven't achieved such a margin for a newly written amendment to the Constitution in nearly half a century. The last such effort was the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age nationwide from 21 to 18, and it cleared Capitol Hill in March 1971. Even after surviving both chambers of Congress in 1971, the 18-year-old vote amendment still had to survive the second stage of the process, the more difficult stage. Just like all other amendments before it, the new voting age had to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That is currently at least 38 states. Another way to look at it, if as few as 13 states refuse, the amendment stalls. This arduous process has winnowed out all but a handful of the amendments proposed over the past 230 years. Every Congress produces scores of proposals, sometimes well over 100. The 101st Congress between 1989 to 1991 produced 214. Some deal with obscure concerns. Many address facets of the electoral process, especially the Electoral College and the choosing of a president. Many are rethreads from earlier sessions of Congress. The one thing most have in common is that they never come to a vote.
Failed to make sure that the background checks now required under the law are done before guns are sold.
Piece of legislation and voting on whether this nation is going to be all in on a new nuclear arms race.
And the toll is staggering. Not just the 30,000 deaths every year, but 4 times as many injuries.
Two that fell short. In 1995, a watershed year with big new GOP majorities in both chambers, 2 major constitutional amendments were brought to votes in the Capitol. One would have imposed term limits on members of Congress. It failed to get even close to 2/3 in the House, so the Senate didn't bother. The other proposed amendment would have required the federal government to balance its budget, not in theory down the road, but in reality and in real time. It quickly got 2/3 in the House, but failed to reach that threshold in the Senate by a single vote, as one Republican in the chamber voted no. So even relatively popular ideas with a big head of steam can hit the wall of the amendment process. How much more challenging would it be to tackle individual arm ownership in a country where so many citizens own arms and care passionately about their right to do so? Overcoming the NRA and other elements of the arm lobby is only the beginning. The real obstacle would be tremendous support for arms in southern, western, and rural Midwestern states, which would easily total up to more than enough votes to block an arm control amendment. There have been 6 amendments that got the needed margins in the House and Senate, but not the needed margin of support in the state legislatures. The most recent was the Equal Rights Amendment, a remarkably simple statement. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex, that cleared Congress with bipartisan support in 1972 and quickly won nods for most of the state. But in the mid-1970s, a resistance campaign began and stymied the ERA in many of the remaining states. The resistance then managed to persuade several states to rescind their ratification vote. With momentum now reversed, the ERA died when its window for ratification closed.
The Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
The previous ban on assault weapons. This has nothing to do with the Second Amendment.
Zombie amendments. Other amendments that met similar fate included one granting statehood to the District of Columbia. Like the ERA, the DC Amendment had a time limit for ratification that expired, but other amendments sent out for ratification in the past didn't have a limit and so might still be ratified, at least theoretically. The granddaddy of these zombie amendments was the very first among the Bill of Rights, which began with 12 items rather than 10. The proposed amendment sought to regulate the number of constituents to be represented by a member of the House, and its numbers were soon outdated, so it has never been ratified and presumably won't be. The one other amendment, originally proposed in 1789 but not ratified as part of the original 10 amendments, sat around for generations. Then, it caught the attention of state legislatures in the late 1980s at a time of popular reaction against pay rises for Congress. This amendment stated that a member of Congress who voted for a pay raise couldn't receive that raise until after the next election for the House of Representatives. That amendment was dusted off and recirculated, and it reached the ratification threshold in 1992, more than 200 years after it had first been proposed. It's now the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, and the last, at least so far. A new constitutional convention. If all this seems daunting, as it should, there's one alternative for changing the Constitution, and that's the calling of a constitutional convention. This too is found in Article 5 of the Constitution and allows for a new convention to bypass Congress and address issues of amendment on its own. To exist with this authority, the new convention would need to be called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. If 34 states saw it, they could convene their delegations and start writing amendments.
Have magazine bans.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
The state of Florida, where we have freedom and the ability to carry whatever firearm we want.
In other states for criminal acts, and those who have stated a desire to get a weapon to do harm.
Some believe such a convention would have the power to rewrite the entire 1787 Constitution if it saw fit. Others say it would and should be limited to specific issues or targets, such as term limits or balancing the budget, or changing the campaign finance system, or restricting the individual rights of arm owners. There have been calls for an Article 5 convention from prominent figures on the left as well as the right. But there are those on both sides of the partisan divide who regard the entire proposition as suspect, if not frightening. One way or another, any changes made by such a powerful convention would need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, just like amendments that might come from Congress. And 3/4 would presumably be as high a hurdle for convention-spawned amendments as it has been for those from Congress dating to the 1700s. Ruling on proper cause. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that New York's proper cause concealed carry law is illegal. This is the biggest increase in armed rights in over 10 years. This decision, which has been in place since 1911, is the biggest increase in armed rights in over 10 years. It also challenges similar rules in 8 other states and the District of Columbia that govern concealed carry permits. The law has been in place since 1911, but the 6 conservative Supreme Court judges said it was wrong. The New York rule is said to have broken the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which says that everyone has the right to be treated equally by the law. The choice was made a few weeks after mass slings in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, and an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, sparked new national discussions about arm control. Democratic politicians said it would put the public safety at risk.
That our law enforcement groups have given us to this bill, because that's vitally important. I felt that was extraordinarily important.
The law is going to remain in effect, and we are going to be safer as a result.
To protect people and neighborhoods from armed crime, President Joe Biden called for common sense arm laws. The lawsuit was filed by the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association and 2 of its members, Robert Nash and Brandon Koch. This was because they were denied licenses to carry hidden handguns for personal safety. Richard McNally of the New York Supreme Court said that neither man had shown that they needed to carry an arm in public for self-defense reasons. The plaintiffs then took that decision to a federal court in New York and asked for a second look. A federal court in New York threw out the case, and the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with the judge. The Bruin ruling by Justice Clarence Thomas changed the standards that lower courts used to figure out if arm control laws were legal. The right majority says that these kinds of rules should take into account the country's history. Following the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals' choice to overturn the first decision in Rahimi's case and agree with the Supreme Court's decision, the crime Rahimi was charged with became illegal in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. This next review by the Supreme Court could have a big impact on how domestic crime protection orders and Second Amendment rights interact, which could have effects on arm laws all over the country. Because of Justice Clarence Thomas's majority opinion, the laws that govern arm laws have changed, which makes arm control measures less likely to work. Since the Supreme Court's decision in Bruin, there have been judicial problems and doubts about the limits of arm rights. A man from West Virginia was accused of illegally having a pistol with a deleted serial number. His case was dropped in May, and a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 5th Circuit ruled that a 30-year federal law that says people with a domestic crime restraining order that can't carry weapons is invalid. The decision will be contested by officials from the Justice Department. This could lead to a new hearing in front of the whole 5th Circuit or a request for the Supreme Court to take the case. Some arm control measures, like so-called red flag laws, have backing from both parties. This could make it easier for the courts to overturn those restrictions. The Bruin ruling from the Supreme Court had been hard to apply, especially when figuring out if an arm law fits with how the country has changed over time.
In the filibuster, expand the court, take away your constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. And we just heard that that's exactly what the Democrats want.
It's hard for district courts to use the new historical tradition test because they don't have the intellectual and methodological knowledge that historians do. People have asked judges to stop enforcing the law while the cases are being reviewed, since many legal cases involving new state armed bans are still in their early stages. A lot of people are upset about Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's recent move to temporarily ban carrying arms in public or under your clothes in Bernalillo County and Albuquerque. Critics say the move goes against the rights of local people under the Second Amendment and sets a bad example. People who support arm rights say that the ban, which was put in place during a public health emergency, is an improper use of government power that could lead to more limitations on personal freedoms in the future. Law enforcement groups and officers are being asked by people who don't like what the governor did to think about the history and effects of the ban. A menacing threat to Second Amendment rights. Choosing to brew the left has absolutely overboard. Every single state controlled by Democrats is in a race to see who can come up with the worst possible arm control measures, trying to outdo other state governors to show the rest of the country that they despise your rights more than the others. It's absolutely bonkers to watch. We're witnessing drastic measures in New Mexico, Illinois, New York, California, and many other states. Today, let's focus on a new bill that could essentially bring an end, a complete end to the Second Amendment in one state. Now let's go to the heart of the matter. The bill we're discussing today is HB 11902 from the state of Washington. This is the same state that recently decided to rename semi-auto firearms with detachable mags and ban anything that can hold more than 10 rounds, all of your supposed protection. Now, they're taking it a step further with this new bill. HB 11902 introduces a comprehensive permitting scheme that, in essence, turns the Second Amendment from a right into a privilege that can be granted or revoked by the state. The bill spans over 70 pages, but let's break down some of the key points here. Firstly, before you even enter a shop to purchase anything, you must obtain a permit from the state of Washington. The process involves fingerprinting, providing personal information, mandatory training, an extensive background check, and psychological evaluations.
But this could potentially impact millions of Americans, law-abiding, Second Amendment supporting Americans.
It's a rigorous and invasive procedure. One notable aspect is that when you sign the application for the permit, you're simultaneously signing a waiver granting the state access to your medical records. That includes both your mental and physical health records, allowing the state to examine them before deciding whether to approve or deny your application. Moreover, the financial burden is significant. Applicants will incur fees for the application, training, fingerprinting, and various other costs up front before even having a chance to exercise their Second Amendment rights. In essence, HB 1102 represents a substantial threat to the Second Amendment, turning it into a burdensome process that transforms a right into a privilege subject to stringent government control. The implications of such legislation reach beyond Washington, serving as a warning of potential infringements on armed rights that could spread across the nation. This is a critical issue that demands attention and vigilant advocacy to protect the fundamental rights of law-abiding citizens. Washington's HB 11902 and the threat to firearm rights. Unsurprisingly, the left's approach to armed control often involves replicating laws from other states or failed federal proposals. Washington's HB 11902 seems to follow this trend, resembling Illinois' FOID card system. However, the real concern lies in the potential erosion of Second Amendment rights, as this permit can be revoked, delayed, and comes with an extensive waiting period. If an individual completes the entire process, including training, background checks, psychological evaluations, it could take up to 60 days before the permit is approved. A delay of even 30 days is a denial of one's right, emphasizing the infringement on the right to bear arms. The state's insistence on a permitting system introduces a significant hurdle and a clear departure from considering arm ownership as a fundamental right. Furthermore, the requirement to provide a unique identifier for each purchase creates an intrusive registry. The state, with the Treasury Department overseeing the data, accumulates detailed information on firearm transactions. This electronic database, searchable by the state,
ensuring that we don't have guns in sensitive spaces, entirely consistent.
raises concerns about privacy and government overreach. The current surge in restrictive firearm laws across states like California, New Mexico, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey indicates a broader trend. The proposed California Carry Bill SB 2, the Go Safe Act in Congress, new background checks, bans, and carry regulations in various states showcase an escalating battle over individual freedoms. The analogy of wild animals fighting in tight spots aptly characterizes the intensifying struggle between citizens and the growing constraints on their rights. Erosion of Second Amendment rights. The ongoing trend in left-controlled states, where each seems determined to outdo the others in dismantling the Second Amendment, is a cause for concern. While bans are already troubling, the introduction of a permit system, as seen in Washington's HB 11902, adds a layer of complexity that transforms the right to bear arms into a state-granted privilege. In essence, obtaining a permit becomes more concerning than the bans themselves, as it fundamentally alters a constitutional right into a state-regulated privilege. The imminent introduction of HB 11902, like in early 2024, backed by a Democratic Party, raises the probability of its passage at the state level. With a roster of Democratic sponsors and co-sponsors, it's evident that this legislation aligns with the left's agenda. While its success on a federal level seems unlikely, states with a Democratic majority or supermajority demonstrate the capacity to enact such restrictive measures.
Everytown USA, Mr. Wilcox has been working with our government to implement this to target
Democrats to restrict Second Amendment rights, like requiring background checks for transfers of firearms.
Comparing this to other constitutional rights, particularly the First Amendment, underscores the absurdity of requiring a permit to exercise a fundamental right. It prompts reflection on how such a notion would fare if applied to free speech, a stark reminder that the Second Amendment should not be treated as a second-class right. The Supreme Court stands on the equality of Second Amendment rights, and the broader sentiment that these rights should not be subjugated to disparate treatment emphasize the need for careful consideration. While it's still early in the legislative process, vigilance is crucial, particularly in states like Washington, where such proposals demand close scrutiny. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. See you next time, and bye for now.